Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When sailor Trevor Grant returned home after months at sea, he didn't expect strangers living in his house. Locks changed and his name erased from the deed. What began as a quiet homecoming spiraled into a high-stakes battle against a suburban tyrant and a web of fraud no one saw coming. They say no one watches your house more closely than nosy neighbors, and I should have known better than to trust silence as safety. My name's Trevor Grant. I'm 38 years old, a senior mechanical operator in a commercial fleet that runs container ships out of Charleston. I spend months at a time on the water, usually Asia-bound, and I've been doing it long enough to know how to leave my house buttoned up tight before I go. But this time, I made one tiny deviation from my usual routine. And that was all it took. The house itself isn't much to look at from the road, just a modest two-story brick place with a big shed, a gravel driveway, and a wraparound porch that my dad built with his own hands back in the late 80s. He left it to me when he passed 6 years ago, 1.5 acres just outside Beaufort, South Carolina. It borders Winding Oaks, a newer neighborhood of pristine cul-de-sacs and white vinyl fences, where every blade of grass is required by some goddamn covenant to grow at the same angle. I never joined their little utopia, never signed anything, never wanted to. My property was its own thing. Old survey lines, old tax records, old blood. That house was mine. Always had been. That would become very important later. Before shipping out this time, 3 months to the ports of Malaysia and Thailand, I did the usual checklist. Turned off the water, bled the pipes, put lights on timers. I stashed the keys to my pickup in a safe, left a note for my neighbor Pete in case of storms, and double-checked the boat trailer was chained to the big oak in back. Normally, I'd also enable the full perimeter security system, the one I installed after some teenagers tried to siphon gas a few years back. But this time, I didn't. I figured it was overkill. I hadn't had a problem in years, and truthfully, I didn't want to pay for a remote monitoring subscription while I was bobbing around the South China Sea. That decision haunts me more than anything. I left on a Monday morning, just as the dew was burning off the grass. Pete waved from across the road, mug in hand. I told him I'd be back by July if the weather and the engine gods were kind. Behind his house, I caught a glimpse of her, Karen Rosewood, queen of the HOA over in Winding Oaks, watering her flower beds in some beige tracksuit like she was cultivating a throne garden. She clocked me loading my bags. We didn't speak. We never really had. I knew her reputation, though. Everyone did. She'd been president of the Winding Oaks HOA for almost a decade, and she treated it like a personal empire. Fined a family for leaving a pumpkin out past Halloween. Sent warning letters to a veteran for parking his truck at a non-standard angle. I even heard she once threatened to tow someone's car for tire overhang onto the curb. Total control freak. But I figured as long as I wasn't technically in her jurisdiction, I didn't have to worry. That changed the moment I left town. I wouldn't find out until much later, but about a week after I flew out of Charleston International, Karen held a special emergency session of the Winding Oaks HOA board. No one outside her tight little circle of cronies even knew about it. She walked in carrying an old file folder, one with my dad's name on it, and claimed that our property had been part of an original planned expansion of the neighborhood back in 2012. She presented a membership protocol addendum allegedly signed by my father before he passed. Total fiction, but she said I had inherited his standing in the HOA and therefore was subject to all rules and dues. Of course, no one verified a damn thing. From that moment, she went to work manufacturing reality. Using that fake document, she updated the HOA membership records to include my property as Lot 84B. She then walked out with a smug little smile, pretending she'd just recovered lost territory like some bored imperialist. Next, she snapped photos of my yard, my wildflower patch, my untamed grass line by the fence, my boat on the trailer, and marked every violation she could invent. Lawn untrimmed over 4 inches, abandoned vehicle, improper storage, failure to maintain community curb appeal. She issued a full set of fines totaling $4,800, a bill for nearly $5,000 based on rules I'd never agreed to from a group I didn't belong to. But here's the real kicker. She mailed the notices to my father's old address in Bluffton, an address that hadn't been valid since 2019. So, naturally, I never responded. How could I? I was somewhere off the coast of the Philippines with a spotty satellite connection and no idea what was happening back home. Back in Winding Oaks, Karen wasted no time moving on to the next phase of her plan: enforcement. She recorded the unpaid fines in her HOA's internal ledger, reported them as delinquent assessments, and initiated a process called non-judicial foreclosure. It was a scam she'd apparently perfected with alarming confidence. She filed an intent to auction notice, again not with the county clerk, but within the HOA board's meeting minutes. And with no opposition, because who the hell was supposed to oppose it, she scheduled a private auction of my property for the end of May. The winning bid? $39,000, paid by an LLC registered out of Savannah called Myrtle Palms Holdings, a shell company managed by, surprise, Karen's cousin on her mother's side. By the time I finally landed back in South Carolina, my house had been sold, my locks changed, and my name erased from a property I had never abandoned, and I still didn't know a thing. I'd been back in South Carolina for less than 24 hours when I found a car parked in my driveway and a stranger's sandals on my damn welcome mat. I figured maybe someone had the wrong address or a guest was waiting for a neighbor. Hell, even Pete's son sometimes parked over here when his driveway got full, but something felt off. The car was a newer Toyota, North Carolina plates, windows rolled halfway down like they owned the place. I didn't like it. I walked up the porch steps with my duffel bag over one shoulder, keys in hand, jet lag sitting heavy on my skull. When I tried the door, it didn't budge. Locked. Which made zero sense because I always left the deadbolt turned inward when I left town. It let me check alignment. But this wasn't misalignment. It was a whole new lock. The key didn't even slide in. I knocked. Firmly. Once. Twice. And then the door opened like I'd disturbed someone in the middle of yoga. A guy in his 30s stood there barefoot, wearing some smug-ass grin and a Jimmy Buffett t-shirt. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of a woman curled up on my couch, eating what looked like kettle corn straight out of the bag. My kettle corn. My couch. "Can I help you?" the guy asked like I was interrupting something private. "Yeah," I said, already feeling the fuse light. "This is my house, Trevor Grant. I live here." He blinked like I told him I was Santa Claus. No, sir. This house was sold at auction. We have the paperwork." Now, normally, I can hold my temper, but that statement hit like a car alarm at 2 a.m. "Sold? At what auction?" "The Winding Oaks HOA foreclosure sale," he said, matter of fact. "We bought it in good faith through a private LLC. Karen said the previous owner abandoned the property." I laughed once. Loud. Karen said. He didn't seem to catch the sarcasm. "Look, I don't want to cause any trouble, but we signed a lease agreement through Myrtle Palms Holdings. We've got a copy if you'd like to see it." They had the nerve to print it and laminate it. A stack of papers with a fake title transfer, a notarized page from some pop-up notary business in Bluffton, and a bunch of HOA garbage with my name crossed out and "in default" stamped in red. I didn't even know where to begin. I called the police. While we waited, the guy offered me a bottle of water. I ignored it and stood on the edge of my own porch like an outsider. Pete must have noticed something was up because I saw his curtains shift across the road. The woman inside was now lighting a candle. In my living room. 15 minutes later, a Beaufort County Sheriff's cruiser pulled up. Young guy, maybe mid-20s, still had that rookie shine. He walked up slowly, asked what was going on. I laid it out. This was my house. I'd just gotten back from overseas, and there were strangers living inside who claimed they bought the place. The officer took a long breath, turned to the couple, and asked for documentation. They handed it over like it was gospel. He looked at me. "Sir, I'm not saying this is legal or illegal, but on the surface, they appear to have documentation that shows a transfer. If it was through the HOA, it might be a civil matter. We can't determine ownership today. You're telling me they can just stay here? If you want them removed, you'll need to file in court," he said. "Right now, they're occupants with a lease agreement. Even if it's fraudulent, it needs to be resolved through a judge." I stared at the siding of my own house until the stucco blurred. He handed me a card with a case number. "You can gather your documents and take it to the county office. Meanwhile, I'd recommend you find alternate accommodations. Don't engage." So I did what any man would do after being evicted from his own house by strangers with laminated lies. I left. I drove to the only motel that wasn't booked solid from a weekend fishing tournament, dropped my duffel on a sagging mattress, and sat there for half an hour staring at the ceiling fan, trying to make the last 36 hours make any kind of sense. I called Pete. He couldn't believe it either. said Karen hadn't mentioned a word, but she'd been strutting around the HOA garden club like she'd won the lottery. He offered me his guest room, but I declined. I needed to think, needed to get a lawyer. But first, I needed to know just how deep this hole went. I woke up in that motel the next morning feeling like I'd been run over by my own ship. The kind of exhaustion that clings to your bones, not from work, not from travel, but from the realization that the world has turned sideways and no one's planning to fix it but you. I spent the day in a haze of phone calls, county records office, tax assessor, clerk of court. My dad's old probate attorney had retired, but his assistant gave me the name of someone local who knows HOA nonsense better than most. That's how I got in touch with Rebecca Becky Moore, mid-40s, hard-voiced, and not the type to mince words. She told me to come in that afternoon and bring everything I had, which wasn't much. I showed up to her office with my ID, a copy of the deed, a folder with my dad's will, and about 7 photos of my house that I'd taken over the years just to prove how not abandoned it was. Becky looked at everything, nodded slowly, then asked the million-dollar question. You ever join that HOA? Never signed a damn thing. Then they have a problem. She started digging immediately. While I sat there nursing a paper cup of bitter coffee, she pulled up the county's official property registry. My lot, still listed under my name. No liens, no foreclosure, no transfer. The HOA had never filed a thing through legal channels. The house was still mine, on paper, in the county's eyes, and under the law. So how the hell are they living in it? I asked. Because this isn't about law, it's about noise. They made just enough fake paperwork to look official to the average person, and that was enough to scare you off and trick a sheriff's deputy. But they overplayed their hand. Big time. She requested a copy of the so-called auction documents from the HOA. They replied with a 6-page PDF that looked like it had been whipped up on a typewriter and a bottle of Chardonnay. Foreclosure notice, transfer authorization, board approval, all full of typos, inconsistent fonts, and a suspicious number of signatures that looked suspiciously similar. Karen Rosewood had signed every document herself. President, witness, notary, executioner. There was even a clause that said, HOA reserves right to reallocate property deemed abandoned for community benefit. Christ, Becky muttered. They're not even pretending to follow real statute. She printed everything out, marked it up with red pen like a high school English teacher having a nervous breakdown, then gave me homework. We need evidence, timeline, photos, witnesses. You're going to sue Trevor and you're going to win. But we need to bury them in proof first. I drove straight to Pete's place. He let me in without a word and handed me a beer, even though it was only noon. When I told him the full story, he shook his head and muttered something about witchcraft in yoga pants. Then he remembered something. I've got the motion cam, he said. You know, the one on the oak tree. Picks up movement toward your driveway. I never turned it off. We checked his system. Sure enough, there she was. Karen Rosewood, 2 weeks after I left, walking right up to my porch with a ring of keys and a clipboard. The timestamp said 11:42 a.m. She opened the lock like she'd done it before, stepped inside, and came out 20 minutes later with a satisfied little smirk on her face. Pete copied the footage onto a flash drive. I took it back to Becky, who watched it twice, then sat back and smiled. This is going to be fun. She filed an emergency injunction the next morning. Meanwhile, I booked a new motel closer to the county courthouse and started living out of my truck in between filing affidavits, requesting video copies from neighbors, and digging through my dad's storage unit for anything that might prove this land had never been under HOA authority. Somewhere between paperwork and microwave dinners, I got a call from a guy named Jason Hunt, local reporter for a channel that ran out of Savannah but liked to cover coastal controversies. Someone, probably Pete, had tipped him off. I met him in a coffee shop the next day and told him the whole story. Jason listened carefully, then leaned in and asked, "Mind if I bring a cameraman next time? Just make sure the mic catches the part where I say I want my damn house back." By the end of that week, my story was on the evening news. Karen didn't respond to comment, but the HOA issued a statement calling it a miscommunication involving procedural errors. The couple still squatting in my house. They'd started renting it out on Airbnb. They listed it as Low Country Escape, Cozy Retreat near the marsh. I stared at the listing on my phone for a long time. There were photos, my porch, my couch, my bedroom, and a comment from a happy guest thanking the hosts for the wine and towel warmers. I hadn't seen a dime, but the account number listed for payout, Becky traced it, belonged to an LLC tied to Karen's nephew, and that's when we stopped playing defense. If I had any illusions that this would be a quick cleanup, they were gone the moment Becky walked into court with a stack of evidence and came out with an emergency hearing date, 30 days out. 30. That's how long I'd have to wait to be heard, while two strangers slept in my bed and collected rent from my goddamn house. But Becky wasn't the type to sit still. She shifted into full war mode. Her paralegals started filing discovery requests. She hired a local title researcher to comb through 30 years of deed history. And me. I started knocking on doors. It turns out Karen had pissed off a lot more people than I'd realized. I visited the home of Margaret DeWitt, a 73-year-old widow who lived just 2 streets over from Winding Oaks. Her porch had more wind chimes than a Buddhist temple, and she kept a parrot named Jimmy, who cursed like a sailor. Margaret told me Karen once fined her $300 because her holiday lights stayed up past January 6th. The kicker, Margaret's house also sat outside HOA boundaries. I told her to go to hell, Margaret said. She came back with a citation and a flyer about community integrity. I laughed in her face. But not everyone does, dear. That phrase stuck with me. Not everyone does. I started thinking, what if there were others? People who didn't laugh. People like me who weren't around to fight back. Becky encouraged me to go public. If we can show a pattern, we shift this from civil case to criminal conspiracy. Jason Hunt, the reporter, ran a second piece. This one more aggressive. It aired on a Sunday evening, right after the local weather, and opened with drone footage of my property, a somber voiceover, and then a slow zoom on Karen leaving the HOA office like a villain from a bad documentary. Jason called it the house they stole. Within 48 hours, 2 more victims came forward. The first was Mr. Ellis, a retired Navy vet, 68 years old. He'd been living in his small home just north of the Winding Oaks property line when Karen showed up with 2 board members and told him he owed back dues for landscaping violations. He'd never signed into the HOA either, but he was recovering from a stroke at the time and too exhausted to fight. Eventually, he sold his home under pressure to one of Karen's suggested friendly buyers. The second was Ruth Montclair, a 79-year-old woman with early-stage dementia, whose daughter had placed her in assisted living last year. Her house was acquired during her stay at a memory care facility, auctioned for $52,000 at another private sale. Her family hadn't even known until someone mentioned it on Facebook. Becky connected with both victims and immediately began filing affidavits. She consolidated everything into what she called a predicate pattern, a fancy legal term for showing that this wasn't just a one-off. Karen had been running a system. We sent a formal complaint to the county's district attorney. Then came the break we didn't expect. A local postal worker named Sandra, mid-50s, sharp as a tack, saw Jason's second report and came forward. She'd handled routes near Winding Oaks for years. Sandra remembered seeing multiple official-looking envelopes with fake return addresses being mailed out of the HOA office, often to outdated addresses, including the one my dad hadn't used in over 4 years. One of them, certified mail allegedly sent to inform me of the lien and auction. Sandra gave a sworn statement. Becky's eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas. This, she said, is mail fraud. That changed everything. See, once you involve the United States Postal Service in the delivery of false legal notices with intent to defraud, it stops being a homeowner dispute and starts being a federal crime. Becky forwarded the documents to a contact in the U.S. Attorney's office in Colombia. Within a week, an FBI agent requested an interview. I met him in a diner outside Charleston. He ordered black coffee and asked questions like he already knew the answers. How long was your property listed on Airbnb? Who controls Myrtle Palms Holdings? Has anyone else received false legal notices from that HOA? He didn't blink when I told him the house was still being rented as a weekend retreat. He just sipped his coffee and said, "We're going to need to talk to Karen." By the time I got back to the motel, Becky was already prepping the next wave. She petitioned the court for a temporary restraining order against Karen, preventing her from accessing any property connected to the alleged fraudulent auctions. A judge signed it the next day. We were no longer playing defense. We were lining up artillery. What started as a personal nightmare was turning into a war. The day the FBI showed up at the Winding Oaks HOA office, Karen wasn't there. I found out through Pete, who called me just after lunch, his voice half panicked, half thrilled. 2 unmarked cars, suits. They're inside the HOA building right now. I nearly dropped my sandwich. Becky had filed the restraining order just days earlier, and we'd barely caught our breath when things took off like a damn rocket. The judge's signature on that injunction must have caught the attention of someone higher up, because suddenly the floodgates opened. Federal subpoenas, warrants, boxes leaving the building. Karen, meanwhile, had gone dark. She'd stopped responding to HOA emails. Yes, even her loyal cronies. She didn't show up to the garden club meeting or the Summer Serenity Planning Committee luncheon she'd organized herself. No one had seen her car. Her phone went straight to voicemail. The woman had disappeared. Becky said it was either arrogance or panic. Probably both, she added, leafing through a fresh folder of testimony. But either way, she knows the hammer's coming, and she wasn't wrong. During the first official inventory of the HOA's office, agents recovered dozens of documents, printed board meeting minutes with retroactive dates, notices of dues and fees for properties never officially within HOA bounds, and correspondence, referencing things like expedited liquidation and non-cooperative asset holders. The language was clinical, cold, and damning. One PDF stood out, a spreadsheet labeled Red Zone Properties. My name was at the top. So were Ellis and Ruth. There were 7 other entries, some highlighted, some marked with amounts in the projected gain column. It was a hit list, plain and simple. That's when the U.S. Attorney's Office made it official. They opened a case against Karen Rosewood, citing multiple instances of wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and financial elder abuse. By then, the Airbnb listing for my house had been taken down, but not before we got copies of all the bookings, 23 rentals over the span of 6 weeks. Nearly $12,000 in revenue, all going to an account managed by a holding company registered in Georgia. The paperwork tied the company to a man named Wyatt Langdon. Guess what? That was Karen's nephew, technically a second cousin once removed. He worked as a part-time real estate consultant and DJ. Yes, really. The DOJ filed to freeze the accounts. Wyatt lawyered up. Fast. Meanwhile, Becky coordinated statements from all the other victims. Ellis gave his in person with more dignity in his handshake than most people manage in a lifetime. Ruth's daughter spoke on her behalf, her voice shaking as she described how she found out her mother's home had been auctioned while she was recovering from a stroke. I don't think there was a dry eye in the courthouse lobby. The media ran with it. Jason Hunt's coverage had snowballed into a multi-segment series titled The HOA Hustle, and his third piece opened with a drone shot of Karen's now-closed office, the blinds drawn, a faded American flag drooping from a rusted pole. Beneath it ran the subtitle, How a South Carolina Neighborhood Became a Private Crime Syndicate. The public backlash was immediate. Former Winding Oaks residents started a Facebook group. A petition demanding HOA reform hit 15,000 signatures in 48 hours. Karen's name was trending locally, and not in the way suburban tyrants usually prefer, but the real gut punch came 2 days later. One of the FBI analysts had pulled the metadata from Karen's emails. In one of them, sent to a friend in Jacksonville, she'd written, "These idiots don't check records. I could fine their dogs if I wanted to." Another email included a PDF attachment titled Revised HOA Authority Map, Internal Use Only. It was a mock-up that expanded the HOA's boundaries by over 30 acres, encompassing more than 24 properties that were never under its jurisdiction. She'd planned to roll this out the following year. Becky took the files to the county attorney. The U.S. Attorney's Office escalated their request for Karen's arrest, but they were too late. Karen had skipped town. It wasn't a rumor this time. She was officially listed as a fugitive. One of the HOA board members, under pressure, cracked, told the investigators Karen had taken out over $20,000 in cash from the HOA discretionary fund 3 days before the subpoenas hit. Said she'd mentioned needing a vacation far from Beaufort. The same day, traffic cameras caught her red Ford Escape heading south on I-95, license plate half covered in mud. It didn't show up again on any toll booths. Every agency involved now had her face in a folder. When the FBI finally did catch up to her, it would be a moment worth remembering. But for now, she was gone, and we were left cleaning up the ruins of what she'd built. They caught her 96 miles outside Tallahassee, headed west with a duffel bag full of cash, a stack of burner phones, and a driver's license that said her name was Marilyn DeWitt. Funny thing, Marilyn DeWitt was the name of the 73-year-old woman with the parrot who'd told me to fight back. I don't know if it was stupidity, cruelty, or just a final twist of the knife, but Karen used her victim's name to try and disappear. Didn't work. She got pulled over for a busted taillight. The trooper ran the plates, saw they were expired, then noticed the ID didn't match the VIN registration. One radio call later, she was in cuffs, screaming about misunderstandings and ungrateful neighbors. When the feds showed up to transport her back to South Carolina, she demanded to speak to a superior. They gave her a bottle of water and drove. The news hit Beaufort like a thunderclap. HO president arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scandal. The headline screamed. Jason Hunt practically had a press tent set up outside the courthouse. It was like watching a local gossip column turn into a Netflix docuseries. The day Karen was arraigned, Becky and I sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching her shuffle in, shackled and deflated. Gone was the sharp-collared beige and power-walking posture. She looked smaller somehow, like the walls had finally stopped obeying her. The judge read the charges one by one: wire fraud, mail fraud, financial elder abuse, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, criminal impersonation, unlawful conversion of property, obstruction, and possession of forged instruments. There were 12 felony counts in total, and the DA warned more could be added. Karen pled not guilty, naturally. Her attorney was some high-priced real estate specialist from Charleston with a jaw like a Republican senator and the charm of a dead fish. He tried to argue that Karen had believed in good faith, that her actions were legal under the broad discretion of the HOA charter. The judge wasn't buying it. Then came the search of her personal property. The FBI executed a warrant on her home, the one she'd lived in rent-free for 20 years thanks to a loophole in the HOA's own budget plan. Inside, they found 2 laptops with spreadsheets mapping targets for future acquisitions, a flash drive labeled Legacy Strategy that detailed how to pressure elderly or absentee owners into selling or defaulting, a burner phone with messages between her and her cousin Wyatt about splitting Airbnb revenue, and, most damning of all, a handwritten ledger, every property, every fake fine, every internal vote, cross-referenced with names, dates, and projected profit. It wasn't just damning. It was organized crime in khakis and pastels. Becky filed a motion for expedited discovery. The court approved. Then came the raids. The HOA's bookkeeper was arrested at her home in Port Royal after trying to shred documents in a backyard fire pit. One of the HOA board members turned state's witness in exchange for immunity. She'd known about 3 of the auctions and confessed that Karen had promised her a piece of admin fees. It unraveled fast. The state attorney general held a press conference on the courthouse steps, called it one of the most disturbing abuses of non-governmental authority in state history, compared it to organized racketeering through suburban bureaucracy. The next week, a special investigator with the State Department of Consumer Affairs filed for forced dissolution of the Winding Oaks HOA. The judge granted it. The organization was stripped of its authority, its accounts frozen, its assets seized. Karen sat in pretrial detention while prosecutors built the rest of the case. I watched it all unfold from the back row of courtrooms and the front seat of my truck. A piece of me still couldn't believe this was real, that someone could take your home, not with guns or fire, but with signatures and silence. That you could be erased while stuck in a cargo ship on the other side of the world. But the truth was laid bare now. The crown had cracked, the queen was caged, and the walls of her kingdom were tumbling fast. There's a kind of stillness that comes after the storm, but mine wasn't peace. It was legal limbo. Even with Karen behind bars, the people squatting in my house were still there, dragging their heels, trying to stall the eviction with bogus counterclaims. Their attorney filed some nonsense about detrimental reliance, as if trusting a criminal made them entitled to my home. Becky shut it down like a guillotine. She filed a motion for summary judgment supported by reams of documents, proof that the HOA never had jurisdiction, proof that the deed had never transferred legally, proof that the auction was fictitious, and proof that the buyers had known, or should have known, that the deal was too good to be real. $39,000 for a house on 1.5 acres with a boat trailer and a 2-car garage? Please. The judge didn't even blink, ruled in my favor in under 15 minutes. I watched the tenants pack their things into a U-Haul that afternoon. They didn't look at me, not once. The woman cried. The guy looked furious, but not at me, at himself, or maybe at Karen. I didn't care. They left behind a mountain of trash, a ruined mattress, and a hole punched clean through my bedroom closet door. But they were gone. That was what mattered. I stepped back inside my home for the first time in over 3 months. The air smelled like burnt incense and stale air conditioning. My couch was covered in cat hair. The kitchen was rearranged like someone had tried to feng shui it. My grandfather's watch, which had sat on the bookshelf since I inherited it, was gone. But the walls were still mine. The floor creaked the way I remembered. The boards on the porch still popped under my weight. I sat on the front steps that evening and watched the sunset pour over the yard, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to exhale. We weren't done yet, though. Becky was preparing for the civil case, a full-blown lawsuit against Karen, her family members, the defunct HOA, and every LLC they'd used to launder ownership and income. We filed for compensatory damages, punitive damages, legal fees, and restitution. The list of charges read like a grocery list for vengeance. Jason Hunt's coverage went national. He appeared on morning talk shows. Other journalists picked up the thread. People from all over the country reached out to me, some to thank me, others to share eerily similar stories. Turns out there were dozens, maybe hundreds, of HOAs with God complexes and no real oversight. And plenty of Karens in positions of unchecked power. The state launched an inquiry into HOA regulations. Lawmakers proposed legislation that would require mandatory third-party audits and restrictions on non-judicial foreclosures. It even got a name, the Grant-Rosewood Reform Act. That part made me want to vomit and laugh at the same time. Meanwhile, the feds finalized their case. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed a superseding indictment, 15 felony counts now. They added wire fraud related to the Airbnb rentals, financial exploitation of the elderly, and interstate racketeering. The charges against Karen's nephew Wyatt stuck too. He pled out, exchanged his cooperation for a lighter sentence. Same with the HOA treasurer. Karen refused any deal. Her trial date was set for January. In the meantime, we requested a formal appraisal of damages. Between the fraudulent seizure, loss of rental income, legal costs, damage to the house, and emotional distress, Becky calculated a compensation figure north of $200,000. The DA's office backed us. The judge approved it in principle pending final judgment. But that wasn't the real prize. The real prize was seeing her sit in court and face every name on the ledger she thought would never talk back. Ellis, Ruth, Margaret, and me. We weren't just fighting for houses anymore. We were fighting to show people like her that power has a limit, and that limit begins at someone's front door. The courthouse was packed, not with Karen's supporters, God no, but with reporters, former victims, HOA skeptics, law students, and at least one guy holding a cardboard sign that read, "My HOA, find me for bird feeders." Karen sat at the defense table in a beige blazer that didn't quite fit anymore, hair flat, lips tight. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked mortal, smaller, fragile even. Not that it changed a damn thing. I was called to testify on the second day of trial. I stood in front of a jury of 12 strangers and told them how I'd come back from the other side of the world to find strangers in my house. My locks changed, and my name stripped off a property I legally owned. I told them how Karen had forged documents, mailed lies, and rented out my home like it was hers to give away. And how it wasn't just me. How it was Ellis, Ruth, Margaret, and at least 5 others whose names were scattered across her private spreadsheet of prey. The prosecution brought in everything. The emails, the fake notices, the internal HOA red zone list, the burner phones, the bank accounts, the Airbnb listings, Karen's voice captured on voicemails saying things like, "He's not around, he won't fight." The jury didn't flinch. They listened like people who'd never cared much for HOAs in the first place. Karen's defense tried the usual song and dance. She believed she had discretionary enforcement power. The lines between jurisdiction were unclear. She acted in good faith. But it all collapsed under the weight of evidence. Her cousin Wyatt's testimony was brutal. So was the statement from the notary who admitted she'd witnessed documents Karen signed alone at night in the office. It took the jury just under 2 hours to return with a verdict, guilty, on all counts. The courtroom didn't cheer, not officially, but the silence cracked with an audible exhale. Some reporters outside clapped. The judge, a stern man with a drawl you could butter toast with, stared over his glasses and said the words I'd been waiting months to hear. "Mrs. Rosewood, you abused your authority in a way this court finds staggering. You turned a legal structure into a tool of extortion. You preyed on the elderly, the absent, and the trusting. This was not negligence. It was enterprise. And it stops now. He sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison, 8 without possibility of parole. Her personal assets were seized. Her pension, gone. Her home, sold to pay restitution. The now former HOA was officially dissolved, its assets liquidated. The board members received lesser sentences or community service, depending on their cooperation. Her nephew got 4 years. I got my house back. Officially. Clean title. No encumbrances. The state awarded me $220,000 in damages, plus full reimbursement for legal fees. Becky got a standing ovation in the hallway. Jason Hunt hugged me. Margaret cried. A month later, I threw a party. We grilled ribs in the yard. Pete brought potato salad. Ellis brought a photo of his old house framed in oak. Ruth's daughter brought lemonade and swore she was moving back from Atlanta because at least this town fights back. We sat on lawn chairs under the stars and talked about anything but HOAs. Jimmy the parrot even showed up, cussing and squawking like he'd won the lottery. I don't pretend justice fixes everything. I still get mail addressed to Winding Oaks HOA member, still find bruises in the drywall and places where the soul of my house feels shaken, but I sleep easy again, with real locks, real papers, and a story people now tell across the country. People knock on my door now, not to find me, not to lie, but to ask, are you the guy from that HOA case? Damn right I am, and I still don't mow my lawn on their schedule.